For this video, we're still on the English Skills Development book, and we're going to quickly review Unit 4 and 5, Paraphrasing Prepositions and Paraphrasing Discourse. We already touched a little bit on paraphrasing prepositions in a previous video that I offered, and we looked at what it meant to unpack a preposition and unpack a word and how a word can possibly have different meanings or take you in a different direction in terms of the conversation. And now we're going to get into a little bit deeper. So the English Skills Development book mentions 6 paraphrasing techniques. Now, you don't have to think about each technique as you're doing it. Whichever one comes naturally to you or is easier for you to act on is always a good tool while you're interpreting, especially when you get stuck. I often find myself, I get stuck just to think, I can see it, I know what you mean, but I just can't grasp the right words. I think it comes from we're operating under stress, time constraints. There's other demands on us during the work, and so sometimes not for lack of fluency, but for other demands happening in the environment, that we may find ourselves a little bit stuck. And sometimes the one word you're trying to get out is the one you can't quite grasp. And then you remember it like 2 seconds later after you no longer need it. So looking at the slide, this is again directly from your book. And so I'm going to give you a second to read that. So paraphrasing techniques is doing a few things for you. One, it's building your linguistic skill. It's giving you a bigger toolbox, or I should call it a file box of vocabulary and different things to turn from. And it's not just only for when you can't find a way to translate something. Maybe this doesn't translate directly, or maybe I didn't understand it. It's not only that, but it's also the consumer's not getting it in the first delivery method that you selected. So having a different way to get that point across is going to make you a better interpreter, because you'll be able to gauge with them and follow their back channel and follow their feedback, whether they're getting it or they're not getting it, so that you could try to offer it a different way. But if you look at that bold phrase there, to paraphrase, the first paraphrasing technique is to paraphrase the original sentence and then interpret the paraphrased version. But something we have to keep remembering and being mindful of is that the paraphrased version must keep the same meaning. And so one example that your book gives is changing the verb tense. The example that your book gives is starting with, there's a woman getting ready to go out the door, paraphrased to, a lady is prepared to leave via the exit. So if you look at both sentences, the meaning is the same. The next technique that your book mentions is word for word substitution, substituting one word each time in the original sentence by finding synonyms. Now, with this technique, it's important to note it may make your paraphrase sound awkward, and there isn't always a word for word translation. So if you're trying to replace a word in a sentence in order to translate it, that might not be an effective solution in order to preserve the meaning of the entire sentence. But it's a great technique because it's a starting point, because you may just need to substitute 1 or 2 words in order to be more effective and to be more clear. The other technique that your book mentions is changing the message from active voice to passive voice and vice versa. And so while you can do that when you're offering a voice interpretation of ASL, I believe that it's much easier when you're going from spoken English or a spoken language to ASL to change a sentence from active to passive voice. So let me say that again, as I think I might have fumbled that. It's easy to do that from active to passive, passive to active, when you're offering a voice interpretation from ASL. But if you're offering a voice to sign rendition, it's a lot easier to switch from passive to active, because signing a passive sentence, you really can't do it. I mean, we always have to start with who's doing what. That's pretty much the syntax of ASL. And here's an example of a passive voice and an active voice sentence. The door was closed by the boy. The boy closed the door. Just switching to indicate who the person who's acting or doing the action, to be clear in the sentence. The other technique mentioned is changing the order of prepositions or reversing the clause within a sentence if it does not alter the meaning. So an example here that is from your book: Fred got sick from a tick bite in July. Later in the summer, he went to the doctor. Look at the paraphrased sentence. Fred went to the doctor last summer after he got sick, after he was bitten by a tick. And so although the clauses were switched, remember that the paraphrase must maintain the same timeline. So he didn't go to the doctor first and then get sick and then get bitten by the tick. The paraphrase has to maintain the timeline. And so it's something to consider, that if you're paraphrasing something or using this technique to render your interpretation, don't make it harder on yourself. If there's a timeline to consider keeping the form. The other technique is moving from specific to general terms. Your book says paraphrase the utterance into a more general form than the original sentence, but still not skew the meaning. But here's the key to remember. If a paraphrase becomes more specific than the original message, the message is already skewed. And here's an example. So the example your book gives is a baker is getting his bowls. He's got the rolling pins, the pans, and the measuring cups out. Why would you offer a general term? Well, suppose someone's signing the bowl and the rolling pin and the measuring cups, and you're not understanding what does he mean by that. And I'm not a baker, so I can't, rolling pin doesn't come to mind. Baker is getting his utensils out. The meaning hasn't changed. The information has been given. No skewed message. So it's a technique when that word doesn't come to mind, but you're understanding the message and the goal of the sentence. On the flip side, if it goes from general to specific, you're not maintaining the meaning. Look at this example. A man is getting his tools ready to fix his car. Now, if your paraphrase says the mechanic is getting his tools ready to fix his car, how do we know that's a mechanic? Who said that was a mechanic? Could have been the neighbor, could have been somebody trying for the first time ever to fix his car, somebody very knowledgeable, somebody who does this for a pastime, for a hobby. The list could go on as to what that sentence really means, but you have skewed the message by calling the man in the sentence a mechanic. So it doesn't work the other way. Paraphrasing from specific to general terms, I have to tell you, is a really great tool to have, because it can get you out of a bind. If you're not sure of how to convey information, be it because you don't have the right vocabulary or you're you're just not getting through, you're not being understood, whatever the reason behind it, or if the information is coming too fast at you, it's better to be generally correct than specifically wrong. Because specifically wrong makes you look bad. It's a skewed message and it messes up the conversation, potentially messing up the reason for the event or the meeting or the reason you're even there, and can come back and bite you. So that's something to really remember. I'll say it again. It's better to be generally correct than specifically wrong. That's the worst option. The next technique that your book mentions is moving from figurative to non-figurative language. So what is figurative language? Which includes idioms. These you have to paraphrase before you translate because idioms don't directly translate ever. And think of the, famous example that your teachers have probably said many times is, it's raining cats and dogs. You can even think of slang terms or things you hear in pop culture, like making it rain, or um, things like it's lit. What does that mean? How do you say that? Those kinds of things. Example that your book gives is the phrase, I'm all thumbs. What does that mean? Can you imagine why somebody would say that? Like maybe they keep fumbling something, or maybe they're it's something to do with their hands. So the social context of why somebody is saying that, as we've already reviewed, would give you an indication. If you don't know, what do they mean by I'm all thumbs? Well, it would really be helpful if you could look at what they're doing when they say I'm all thumbs. Maybe they're fumbling. This, if you think about, I want to interject a little bit of working on video. If you don't have something to see or to reference, you're kind of just guessing what they might mean. So if I'm all thumbs means I can't text the right thing, but you can't see, is that what they're referring to? You can make a general paraphrase. I'm not good with my hands. Gets the message across. The other example, I'm boiling. I'm angry. So you wouldn't directly interpret I'm boiling to a different spoken language or to even sign language. That doesn't really translate. It's a idiom or a different way to express the fact that you're angry. So the common thread that we keep seeing in your ASL skills development book and your English skills development book, in the videos and in what we've been learning, is that you have to have these tools under your belt to improve linguistic flexibility, because that's going to help you interpret more effectively. The more options you have, the more fluent and fluid and seamless and smooth you can process the message. And I believe the shorter your lag time, the shorter your processing time. So why we're doing these exercises is to create a strong foundation for that skill that we're working toward, which is the simultaneous interpretation skill. But also, you want to be really great at expressing yourself in ASL. I will say this, I do believe it is two different functions of your brain. I always think to myself that and I don't think I'm just saying this. I've talked to a few other interpreters who feel similarly, is that I feel like I'm a really awesome interpreter, not so great a signer. You may see, even in the videos that I post up, it takes me time to practice. It takes me time, I'm thinking on my hands sometimes, I'm pausing more than I would if I was interpreting, because interpreting is a different process in my mind, in my brain that's happening. I'm hearing somebody else's words and somebody else's expression, and somebody else has already thought of how to express this idea. And I'm really good at the skill of putting it into sign or even offering a voice interpretation. But when it's my own words and I have to express myself, all of a sudden I'm like, I promise you, I'm an interpreter. It happens, and I've spoken to other people. I think I'm getting better at it because I have to. I'm posting videos sometimes, but it's a true belief I have, and I have asked other people. Some people, likewise, are really great at simcomming, and they're so smooth, and they can do it. I can't simcom to save my life. I can maybe simcom a couple sentences, and then I'm like, oh, can we pick a language? Because it's too complex. Now, to be fair, simcomming is difficult anyway because we know that ASL doesn't follow English order, and we know that you're going to drop information in one or the other languages. You're going to slow down dramatically. Still, there's people who can do it very well for a long time and hold a conversation. I'm not one of those people. It's very difficult for me to simcom. But that doesn't take away from my skill. I know that I'm a great interpreter and I work really hard at being a great interpreter. But I do see the difference in my ability to simcom and my ability to express myself when it's my own words. Because very clearly, I'm working more at the interpreting skill than on my other skills. Like I just gave myself away. So back to those paraphrasing techniques. So this is paraphrasing discourse and it's actually unit 5 of the English Skills Development book. And if you've noticed, this is what we've been doing. This is what we've been working on. Restating a story or text in words different than those to the original. So we've been along the way doing some assignments that have been building up this skill and doing this exactly. The paraphrase should contain the same information, but notice it is not an exact repetition. Sometimes the order of the paraphrase could be less crucial, while at other times it's important to preserve the order of the information, and it's your job as the interpreter to know when to maintain that form. But as we saw the example before of the person who got bitten by a tick and then went to the doctor sometime after July, changing the form was fine as long as we maintained the timeline. But as you can see, if you do that, you're just kind of giving yourself a little bit more work to remember the timeline even as you move it around. So as you're working the actual act of interpreting, don't make it harder on yourself. You already have a big load on your brain. You're already doing a lot by listening, understanding, processing, producing. Don't give yourself the added task of remembering where things go and the timeline and what's first, second, third. Try to maintain the form as much as you can. Of course, it's a tool and technique that you can use, but I'm just saying to you, just consider that this is also your responsibility is, if it's not important, do it. There's times that um, you can hold information and you just add it in later because you're maintaining the meaning. And there's different reasons why you'll do that. We can talk about that a little bit later. Um, but if it's not necessary to do that, there's no need to give yourself that extra responsibility of preserving the information and preserving the timeline. So there's two things that determine the form of the paraphrase. You have to have comprehension of the source text, which in our class very basically means you must have reached a certain level of ASL skills in order to comprehend the message so that you can first understand it and process it. But secondly, you've got to have enough skill in your expressive ASL to be able to render the message. So you should feel good because that's what we're doing. So again, those two things determine that form of the paraphrase. And you may have noticed if you struggled with any of the videos that we watched, if you struggled with it, it may have been difficult for you to answer the questions where it said, what's the main point, what's the main idea, or my own questions when I asked, give a summary. You may have found it a little bit difficult. It was because you didn't have full comprehension of the text, or possibly not full ability to express it. But we're building on it, so we're getting there. Something important to keep in mind about question forms and functions. So it's your job to quickly identify the forms and functions of language as it's coming at you. It's important to quickly identify as the information reaches you, be it from spoken language or sign language. It's important for you to identify, is this a statement, is this a question, and quickly start your interpretation. And what this means is you know that a statement conveys information, whereas a command orders someone to do something. But questions are different because questions include intonation, gestures, and syntax that come together with a question that indicate to us somebody's asking something. And if we think about it, the way we see a question in ASL, we see it in the facial grammar. We hear it when we hear it in spoken language, and we sometimes see the gesture that accompanies it, like a head nod or a pointing, etc. Gestures, and the syntax, but also the intonation in a question. This is really something I want you to think about, because I have seen misunderstandings because an interpreter is unsure of their interpretation and they've rendered it as a question, but it's not a question. And so then the other person's confused. Like, I'm just going to think of a sentence. I like hamburgers. And say the interpreter's not sure what they saw, and they're like, I like hamburgers. That sounds like a question, right? Imagine the confusion. So always be mindful of the intonation in your voice. And I always like to say, make mistakes with confidence. So while I said earlier, it is better to be generally correct than specifically wrong, it's also better to make a mistake with confidence, because then you don't appear to lose your client's confidence. You can, and it doesn't mean you're faking it. It just means that you have the confidence to say, oh, interpreter error, that was wrong. And your confidence gives the client, both the deaf and the hearing, confidence in you, because mistakes are human. Mistakes are going to happen. Oh, you missed that one. You confidently made that mistake. Sometimes that lack of confidence we hear in a voice interpretation come across as a question, which is the reason that I added this on this slide. So if we go back to the slide where it says rhetorical questions generally function as statements of information or clarification rather than an attempt to gain information. So rather than an actual question, it's important to know when somebody means something rhetorically, because you need to know so that you can interpret it effectively. Sometimes rhetorical questions serve as a way to grab attention. An example your book uses is when a professor asks, ready for that test? As she's passing it out. And then echoic questioning, which is when the listener repeats the answer. It's interesting that there's a reason behind that. The listener is actually trying to buy time. How much experience do you have in this field? How much experience do I have? Before they give their answer. It's important to know these things, and it's important to know the intention behind communication because it helps you interpret it more effectively. That was the last slide. So this concludes Unit 4 of the English Skills Development book, and it's only partial of the Unit 5 Paraphrasing Discourse. What I have left out is the idiomatic expressions that we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I have left that for you to read. And thanks for watching.